All around this country, there used to be a hell of a lot more forests like this.
That's President Joe Biden on Earth Day in 2022. He's standing in a Seattle park. Cherry blossoms and Douglas firs are all around him.
That's why today I'm signing an executive order to conserve our forests that do so much to protect us. Our forests are our planet's lungs.
The president takes his pen, ready to sign the order to protect mature and old-growth forests on federal lands.
I just think this is the beginning of a new day, and we're going to just have to overtake the opposition on this. I really mean it.
But over 2 years later, these forests were still being cut under the Biden administration's watch, nearly the same amount as they were under Trump, who will take office again next year and could undo some of his predecessor's climate policies. Conservation groups and environmental lawyers are fighting for the protection of the old trees.
BLM! BLM, you've been told! Stop blue and gold! Stop.
I think there is a massive disconnect between the administration and what's happening on the ground and their local staff.
It really feels like the whole thing was rushed from the beginning. We were wasting our time in places where I knew there weren't going to be spotted owls.
From the Gert Boyle studio, I'm Jen Chavez, and this is The Evergreen, a podcast from OPB about the place you call home. Today, how logging has continued in Western Oregon, the heart of the nation's remaining old-growth forests. OPB's April Ehrlich and ProPublica's Mackenzie Funk investigated and followed the course of one controversial timber sale in Southern Oregon. And they're here with us to break it down. April, Mac, thank you for being here. Welcome to the show.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, thanks.
So, April, the reporting you and Mac have done here focuses on an executive order President Biden signed 2 years ago, looking to protect the nation's old trees. But let's back way up for a moment. For those of us who might not be familiar, what is an old-growth forest?
That is a really fun question and one that's been heavily debated by many people, and it really depends on who you ask. Even our federal forest agencies struggle to define the word old growth or phrase old growth. They recently published a white paper titled The Wicked Problem of Defining and Inventorying Mature and Old Growth Forests. But generally speaking, here in the Pacific Northwest, they're super old forests that haven't had any major disturbances like fire or clear cutting in a long, long time. These forests are usually very complex visually. You'll see lots of different kinds of plants, mosses, lichens, a lot of duff on the ground. That's leaf litter and pine needles. And you'll see a bunch of different kinds of trees. Old trees, young trees, dead trees, maybe some trees with weird gnarled branches that survived a winter storm. And all of that complexity is super important to insects and wildlife. Like hollow, dead trees provide homes to certain birds and bugs, and moss-covered branches are actually really great nesting places for marbled murrelets, which are these chubby little seabirds that look sort of like flying potatoes, and they move between the ocean and the coastal forest. They actually need mature and old-growth forests to survive, as do northern spotted owls. But both species are struggling as we lose more and more old forests to pests, wildfires, and commercial logging.
Okay, you have painted an extremely vivid picture here. And Mac, can you kind of explain to us why it's so important to have these forests full of old giant trees?
Yeah, well, I mean, these forests are at the center of the two biggest environmental issues of my lifetime. Growing up in Oregon in the 80s and 90s, I was surrounded by the timber wars, which pitted logging communities and the timber industry against environmental groups and a populace that I was increasingly conservation-minded. And at the center of the fight was the spotted owl, which, as April said, needs these old-growth forests to survive. But today, many of us are focused on a different issue, which is climate change. And conifer forests in Oregon's Coast Range, especially old conifer forests like these, filled with giant trees, are incredible at trapping and storing carbon. Per acre, they do more to help fight climate change than almost any other forest on the planet, and that includes the Amazon.
Thank you. And I'm glad you mentioned the timber wars of the 80s and 90s. OPB actually has a great podcast that y'all can check out if you haven't, called Timber Wars, all about that. So, all right, you all follow the course of one particular controversial timber auction in Southern Oregon. The Bureau of Land Management, or BLM, a government agency that oversees millions of acres of land, calls it blue and gold. The BLM project was shelved after Biden's executive order, but now it's back on. And we're going to dig into the details of blue and gold in a minute. But first, what changes did this executive order actually call for in the first place?
Yeah, I mean, the executive order makes a lot of, statements about the importance of old trees and what kind of is threatening them right now, like wildfires. But specifically, Biden's order asked the two biggest public land agencies, the Bureau of Land Management and the Forest Service, to analyze these big threats to old forests and then develop policies for addressing those threats. Biden also asked these agencies to inventory and map out the nation's mature and old-growth forests so they know where to focus their attention.
Okay, so the BLM is one of two agencies that were affected by this. When this order was signed, how did the BLM respond? Did they actually make changes to their existing forest plans?
No, the BLM didn't change much. Existing forest plans remain in place, and timber sales that the agency was planning before the order are still going forward after it. But one exception is this blue and gold sale that we focused on. And this is the only timber project that we've been able to identify that was put on hold after the executive order and because of the executive order. The BLM district manager in Roseburg, her name is Heather Whitman, she told April and me that it did change after she decided to pull it for further analysis. And one of the changes is that they'll be doing more forest thinning in some areas instead of what the agency calls regeneration harvest, which is a kind of cutting that to you and to me would probably look a lot like a clear cut, only with a few scattered stands of trees and left in place. But overall, blue and gold, now that it's back on, it will still be about the same size as before, which is more than 3,000 acres. And it'll produce about 2/3 as much timber as originally planned, or even more.
To paint a picture for folks, let's talk more about this timber auction y'all went to in September. What was it like, and how much does land sell for?
Yeah, so BLM has different districts that manage different land areas. So this timber sale took place at BLM's Roseburg district office, which is about an hour south of Eugene. During this auction, BLM was basically selling the ability to log trees in two different parts of the blue and gold project area. Neither Mac or I had ever actually been to a timber sale before, so we had no idea what to expect. Like, would there be an auctioneer calling out numbers super fast while people yelled out bids like, I have 100 over here, 150 over here, how about 200? Like, was it going to be like that, or was it going to be something a little bit more, boring?
I think the first one is how I am imagining it, as someone who has also never been to a timber sale.
Well, that certainly would have been very exciting, but we didn't actually get to go see the timber sale. We walk into this small lobby with a front desk and some chairs. There's some large maps on the walls showing the infamous checkerboard pattern that divides public and private lands in Southern Oregon, which I'll get into a little bit more later. It's pretty complicated. So about a dozen people start coming in one by one. They write their names on the sign-in sheet. They make some small talk. Most of them wore blue jeans and tucked collared shirts, and they all seem to know each other. Over time, we learned that this auction will happen in a room behind a glass security door. And unless you actually plan on bidding, you're not allowed inside. Yeah, so Mac and I tried our best, but we just couldn't get in there to watch the auction. So instead, we waited in the lobby for about an hour until people started filing out. In the end, BLM sold the ability to log trees on about 560 acres of forest that day, and that brought in $4.2 million.
Wow. And very valiant effort by you both to get in. Yes, you did certainly try. So we're talking a lot about blue and gold. Can you give us a sense of what blue and gold looks like?
Yeah, it was easier to get into that than it was into the room with the auction.
I bet.
Yeah. Well, the term that ecologists use to describe old-growth forests is decadent. Lots of layers of canopy and snags and fallen logs. and a variety of tree species, not just a monoculture of Douglas fir, not a Christmas tree farm. And parts of blue and gold do look like that. They're rich, they're wild, they are decadent. But the ONC lands, as April said, are a patchwork of public and private lands. And even many of the private areas have been logged and replanted. And even the publicly owned areas are different one to the next. And one of the areas we visited was about 30 minutes from Roseburg. To get there, we drove with a retired BLM wildlife surveyor, Eric Reeder, and we headed into the Coast Range, roughly following the Umpqua River. And turning off the main highway just before Yellow Creek, you go up this, at first a paved road, past a home, past an empty home, past a quarry, past an area that had been logged on private areas, and you go up and up smaller gravel roads. And some of the forest around you looks like it's been cut. Some of the forest looks like it has been replanted and grown up very tightly packed. And then we came to this area above Yellow Creek that is part of the timber sale and part of the timber project, and walked in past these thick trees on the side, and it looked decadent.
What do you think, Eric?
What's that?
The age?
I would say 4 to 600.
Okay, 4 to 6.
It had the fallen logs. It had a couple huge trees. You know, you can't get your arms around them kind of trees. You could lie down on the ground and it would be wider than you are tall kind of trees, and broken branches above, and they were widely spaced, and you could see different species, and it felt, you could tell you were someplace that was a rich ecosystem. And that area, interestingly, above Yellow Creek, in the planning documents that the BLM put out, they estimate its age at 90 years old. They say that it is densely packed, that it is not very ecologically rich. They describe it as sort of what a tree farm would look like after about 90 years. But that wasn't it. That wasn't what we saw. And it was right there 30 minutes from Roseburg.
Oh, interesting. And I love I just have to say, I love the consideration of forests as decadent. That's creates such a strong visual for me. Yeah, super interesting, that discrepancy in the planning documents. So part of the reason the BLM keeps chopping down trees is because of this law from the 1930s called the O&C Act of 1937. April, can you explain this law and why it's so important to this story?
Another really complicated topic that
I love to dig into those on the Evergreen, especially when they're literally about evergreens. So
That's true. Well, I'm sure there are a lot of listeners who are familiar with the complicated history of the ONC lands in Oregon, but I'm going to try my best to quickly summarize it for those who aren't. So back in the 1800s, Congress wanted to finish a railroad between Portland and San Francisco to encourage more settlements in the West. So it deeded out tens of thousands of acres in the West to the Oregon and California Railroad Company as an incentive to finish this railroad. Those lands were distributed in a checkerboard pattern, with the government retaining the alternate sections for future growth. The railroad company was required to sell its parcels to settlers for super cheap. But once railroad executives realized how lucrative these heavily forested parcels were in terms of logging, they didn't exactly follow through. The railroad company actually tried to keep some of the lands or sell parcels to people posing as settlers, only to buy them back. So Congress took back the remaining lands and then revested them as public lands under what's known as the O&C Act. It calls on the Bureau of Land Management to manage these 2.6 million acres for, quote, permanent forest production. Part of the proceeds from timber sales would go to 18 counties that include ONC lands and their properties to make up for the lost tax revenue of having so much federal property within their boundaries. And for the last 87 years, environmental groups and timber companies have butted heads on what exactly the ONC does and doesn't do.
Okay, yes. Thank you for breaking that down. You're right that it is complicated. Mac, so what does the ONC Act do? Does it require the BLM to log on those ONC lands?
Well, it sounds like you're the kind of podcast where you really like to get into the weeds, so I'm going to read something to you from the ONC Act, and then we can all try to interpret it together.
Okay, that sounds fabulous.
April mentioned the permanent forest production part of the ONC Act, but then it goes on in the same paragraph and says it'll be blah, 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 following the principle of sustained yield for the purpose of providing a permanent source of timber supply, protecting watersheds, regulating stream flow, and contributing to the economic stability of local communities and industries, and providing recreational facilities. Some people see this as one of the first multi-use laws on the books, looking at our public lands as something that should be used not just for one thing, but also there's some conservation goals in there. You can see the protecting watersheds, the idea of sustained yield. There's a bit of conservation in there. And so part of the reason that environmental groups and timber companies have been fighting over this, and local communities for so long, is that it does seem to give the BLM room to manage it for multiple uses. And I don't think anyone can say, no, Congress did not intend for any logging to happen on these lands. Clearly it did. But I think the difficulty with this law is that Congress also wanted the BLM to manage them for other purposes, other uses. And it's up to the BLM ultimately to decide how it does that. And that can be setting its own goals for how much timber to cut, which it has done. It can be setting aside certain areas for conservation, which it has done. And because this law is so old and vague, there's a lot of weight put on the agency to decide what to do. And we've got lawsuits from both sides trying to get it to either cut more or cut less, conserve more, conserve less.
That's so interesting. So it does sound like a multi-use type of law, but it's really up to the BLM to decide what that balance is. We're going to continue this conversation coming up after a break, why the Bureau of Land Management is getting sued. Thanks for listening to The Evergreen, our podcast from OPB about the place you call home. If you dig what you hear, subscribe to us on your favorite podcast app, and we'll brighten your Monday morning just a little bit with something new and exciting to listen to each week. You can also follow OPB on Instagram at OPB Photo, or follow me directly at Jen Chavez OPB. That's Jen with 2 N's, and I'll keep you posted on what Team Evergreen is up to. And remember, this episode about the state of old-growth forests, literally evergreen trees, and all the great OPB reporting and storytelling you hear on this show is made possible by the support of many thousands of OPB members. That is the beauty of public media, my friends. Support our journalism by becoming an OPB sustaining member today at opb.org/pod. And now, back to the show. April and Mac, you've both been investigating for OPB and ProPublica the logging happening here in Oregon by the BLM since President Biden's executive order. So lay it on us. What have you found?
Well, we found that under Biden, BLM hasn't changed much about the way it logs its forest. It's actually on track to log about 47,000 acres of public lands, nearly the same amount as under the Trump administration. And Biden's executive order didn't seem to change much for the agency either. OPB investigations editor Tony Schick ran some data for this story, and he found that since Biden's directive, logging on BLM lands has actually increased pace since the executive order.
Yeah, and not only has logging increased on BLM lands in general, it has specifically increased in areas that the agency itself identifies as old enough to be considered mature or old-growth forest. So it has increased in the areas most important for fighting climate change, and most important for species like the marbled murrelet and spotted owl. Some important caveats here. Some of this uptick may be because of salvage logging after the 2020 wildfires and other fires. And in most cases, the BLM's existing rules, which were in place even before Biden's executive order, do mean that they avoid cutting down the biggest and oldest trees. Instead, they try to cut around them. So imagine a big tree left alone in the landscape with the forest around it gone. So you might have an old tree, but no more do you have old growth forest.
Right, and all of the important other aspects of that ecosystem around the old tree. And Mac, how open has the BLM been with the public about its logging plans and, their potential environmental impact?
Well, to the agency's credit, there is public notice for these logging projects. And there's a period in which they take public comments before the projects are finalized. The environmental analysis is posted publicly. There's a website where you can look at all these documents. But environmental groups take issue with how rushed the timeline can be for some of these comment periods and for the analyses. And most importantly, they take issue with the analysis itself of these environmental impacts and how it's been done and if it's been done well enough.
Got it. And April, what are conservation groups saying about this?
So like Mac was saying, they accuse BLM of fast-tracking timber sales so it can meet its own timber targets. These groups point to multiple times where BLM tried to skip doing a more comprehensive environmental impact statement so it could have timber companies log trees on ONC lands. Environmental groups have sued over this practice, saying federal law requires BLM to actually get on the ground and take a hard look at how logging would impact these forests and vulnerable species. And more often than not, those environmental groups have won these cases.
Okay, and so there have definitely been multiple lawsuits here. Matt, can you tell us what's the most recent lawsuit?
The most recent one is over blue and gold. It was filed a couple days before we showed up for that timber auction. And the groups behind it say this is another case where the BLM has rushed the environmental analysis, that the agency didn't look in detail at carbon storage or climate change, at landslide risk or invasions of non-native plants, that it didn't take into account Biden's executive order and really grapple with what the executive order wants. And the analysis that the BLM did do found that 119 acres of prime spotted owl habitat will be destroyed through this logging, and another 1,539 acres will be, quote unquote, downgraded. And up to 13 marbled murrelet chicks will be killed over the next 20 years.
Wow. And to understand this more, you talked to Tom Baxter, who is an owl surveyor. He was contracted to search the forest for endangered spotted owls. But he says,
It really feels like the whole thing was rushed from the beginning.
April, what was his experience working with the BLM?
Yeah, so up until the blue and gold sale, Tom Baxter had been working for wildlife surveying companies for about 14 years. These are companies that BLM and others hire to survey a forest ahead of logging to make sure that there aren't any spotted owls or other endangered species that could be harmed in the process. It's a lot of work, and basically, surveyors have to drive out into the forest late at night. Then they hike into the forest, and they usually bring out these big tools and make spotted owl calls and wait to see if, they can hear any spotted owls respond. Tom told me that he's almost died multiple times just from his truck almost veering off some muddy road. Anyway, so he likes to use his own voice when he's making these owl calls, and he actually demonstrated it for us while we were there. Tom told me he usually gets a notice months ahead of a surveying job. But this time, BLM only gave them a few weeks. It wasn't nearly enough time to rally enough surveyors for the job, so they ended up being understaffed. Then Tom said they wasted their time surveying areas that they knew wouldn't have any owls, instead of focusing their time on areas where the most spotted owls could potentially be, areas with the most, old growth characteristics. This job stressed him out so much that he ended up calling it quits. And he says this is his last surveying job and he's taken a job elsewhere.
This story shows the cultural divide over how to manage forests. On one hand, there's conservation groups and environmental lawyers saying,
I think there is a massive disconnect between the administration and what's happening on the ground and their local staff.
That was Nick Cady, a Cascadia wildlands attorney. On the other hand, you have timber companies wanting to log more, and local communities interested in the money and jobs that timber production can bring.
It's not just the primary mills. It's everything that supports the mills, all of the manufacturing, obviously the trucking, and it goes on and on.
That was Doug Robertson, executive director of the Association of O&C Counties. Mac, did you hear from the White House or the BLM about their perspective?
Yes, a White House spokesperson talked about the executive order, talked about this inventory of old growth and mature forests that the administration saw through, and told us that the Biden-Harris administration has made, and this is a quote, made unprecedented progress toward the climate-smart management and conservation of our nation's forests. The spokesperson didn't answer specifically a question about why the cutting has accelerated under Biden in some areas and why it's kept pace overall with Trump. As for the BLM, a spokesperson named Brian Hires, he said, "We are a multi-use agency." And that, I think, harkens back to what we were talking about with the O&C Act. And he said, "We are committed to forest health and providing the timber Americans need." And it was interesting. They said, look, we already manage these forests on behalf of America, and we already had these conservation goals in mind. We've been doing this for years. They framed Biden's executive order not as a new direction, but as something, as further clarity on their existing direction, and something that builds on the quote unquote existing efforts to protect mature and old growth forests. So per the BLM, they say, don't worry, we're already doing this.
Interesting. Further clarity, but not a new direction. So I should say we are recording this conversation the morning of Election Day. And, you know, of course, this is going to be a consequential election. And there's a lot still up in the air. So I ask this next question with that in mind. What do you all see as next in this story?
Yeah, I mean, you're right. A lot of direction in terms of public lands and forest management is really determined by the presidential administration. So it'll be interesting to see what happens going forward. But I think for me, I would like to keep an eye on how BLM and Forest Service are doing what's called salvage logging. Earlier, Mac had mentioned that, you know, some of this increase in logging we're seeing on BLM lands could actually be a consequence of recent wildfires. Salvage logging is when agencies go into a forest that has experienced a wildfire, and then they cut the remaining trees that are still salvageable. A lot of research has shown that leaving these trees behind is good for wildlife and plants, which can feed or make homes in the decaying material. Researchers with the Forest Service have also recently found that salvage logging in spotted owl habitat can actually increase the owl's risk of extinction.
Yeah, and I would say that we often see administrations, especially Democratic administrations, in this lame duck period after an election, take big action to set public lands aside for national monuments. And the Biden administration will still have power to do something no matter who wins the election. And in either case, the BLM still works for Biden. Biden could still order them to pause existing timber sales, or at least ones that are coming up, could order them to take another look at the executive order and could ask them to reassess the O&C Act and try to interpret it, given some recent court decisions, for really how many board feet of timber they need to pull out of these forests. That's all stuff that they can do no matter who's coming in next, even if whoever comes in next overturns much of that. And the final thing that I've been looking at is the idea that these forests may be worth more to local communities and to the country as a whole standing rather than cut down because of their ability to store carbon. And so if there were a mechanism to get money to these local counties based on keeping these trees standing rather than cutting them, that is something that would be, I think people are looking into and could be a win-win.
Well, we're definitely going to continue following this story. April and Mac, thank you both so much for kind of unpacking your reporting on this for us today.
Yeah, thanks for giving us time.
Yeah, thank you.
April Ehrlich is OPB's Lands and Environmental Policies reporter, and Mackenzie Funk is a Northwest-based reporter for ProPublica. We'll leave a link to their investigation for OPB and ProPublica in the show notes. Thank you for listening to The Evergreen, a podcast from OPB. Mia Estrada produced this episode, and our technical director is Stephen Cray. Nalene Silva engineered the episode. The OPB podcast team also includes Julie Sabatier and Sage Van Wing. April Ehrlich and Mackenzie Funk did the interviews you heard. The music in this episode is from Audio Network. And before we let you go, we have an upcoming episode about cats that go with their people on outdoor adventures, hiking, snowshoeing, and even paddleboarding. Have you taken your cat on adventures? We would love to hear about it if so. Please tell us your story, and we might just feature it in the episode. You can record a voice memo and email it to us at theevergreen@opb.org. Thank you so much. I'm Jen Chavez. Catch you later.